I was standing in a pediatric ICU hallway at 2:47 in the morning, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly, the floor smelling of antiseptic and cold coffee, with a bill for $5,500 in my hand, when my husband told me to deal with it myself, because he and his mother had just closed on a $620,000 beachside home. 14 years, 4 months, and 11 days of active duty, 2 deployments nobody is allowed to ask me about. And I was standing there being told to go beg the military like I was a stranger asking for change outside a gas station. If you're watching this at your own kitchen table, at a hospital, in a car in a parking lot, at an hour you shouldn't be awake, comment where you're watching from right now. Then hit like and subscribe, because what happened 72 hours later, when my husband was pounding on my front door, is the part they never expected me to survive long enough to tell. There were 3 things sitting on top of me that night. 3 separate weights. And I want you to hold all 3 the way I had to hold them, because none of them waited politely for the others to finish. The first was a folder my divorce attorney had color-coded in red, sitting on my kitchen counter, because 48 hours earlier my husband Daniel had filed an emergency motion in Cumberland County Family Court, asking a judge to freeze our joint accounts and grant him temporary primary custody of our daughter, on the grounds that I was, in his sworn affidavit, psychologically unfit due to unspecified military trauma and prolonged absences. The second was 15 years of marriage, in which my mother-in-law, Patricia Reyes, had never once called what I did for a living my career. She called it my little desk job, my paperwork thing, my government babysitting, and she said it in front of guests, in front of my own daughter, in front of the pastor at our wedding rehearsal dinner, without a flicker of hesitation, because she believed it, and because my husband let her believe it. The third thing was smaller and heavier than the other 2 combined. My 7-year-old daughter Emma's insulin pump had failed at 11 p.m., her blood sugar had spiked past 400, and the emergency endocrinology consult, plus the replacement pump copay after our new family insurance plan, the one Daniel had switched us to without telling me, the one with a $4,000 deductible, came to $5,500, due within 72 hours or Emma would be bumped off the priority replacement list. I called my husband. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear champagne glasses in the background, could hear his mother's laugh, could hear the specific brand of silence that means someone is choosing their words to sound reasonable while being cruel. He said, "We just bought a beachside home. Deal with it yourself." And before I could answer, his mother took the phone from him. I heard the exact rustle of it changing hands, and she said, "Leave my boy alone. Go beg the military." And then she hung up. I need you to understand who I actually am, because for 15 years almost nobody in that family bothered to ask. I am Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell Reyes, United States Army, retired as of March of this year after 14 years, 4 months, and 11 days of active service. I do not say retired the way civilians say it. I mean I signed paperwork that ended a career most of my own family never understood, because most of what I did was never something I was permitted to explain at a dinner table. I enlisted at 21, was commissioned 4 years later, and by the time I was 30, I was running classified medical logistics and forward intelligence coordination for Special Operations Extraction Teams out of a facility at Fort Bragg that does not appear on any public tour. I have a bronze star with a Valor device that lives in a safe deposit box, because Patricia once told a room full of her book club that medals are for men who actually fought, dear. And I decided that night I would rather have my daughter grow up thinking her mother did paperwork than watch her grandmother perform outrage over facts she was never cleared to hear anyway. I met Daniel when I was 28, home on a 2-week leave, at his cousin's wedding in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was a real estate broker, charming in the specific way men are charming when they've never had to be anything else. And he told me on our 3rd date that my job sounded stressful, but at least you're not in real danger, right? It's mostly logistics and computers. I let that sentence stand uncorrected for 15 years, because correcting it would have meant explaining things I had sworn not to explain, and because in the beginning, I loved him enough to let him be comfortable in his own confusion. I remember the specific texture of the dress uniform jacket I wore that Christmas. Wool blend, heavier than people expect, the ribbons cold against my collarbone, in a house kept at 68 degrees, because Patricia believed anything warmer was wasteful. I remember the smell of her kitchen, clove and burnt sugar candles she bought by the case from a catalogue, and I remember thinking, even then, that a house could smell like celebration and still feel like a courtroom where I had already been convicted of being ordinary. The marriage did not collapse all at once. It eroded the way riverbank erodes, in pieces too small to notice until the whole shape of the thing is different. Daniel's business had two genuinely good years, in 2019 and 2020, when the housing market ran hot, and he closed on beachfront properties for clients with more money than sense, and in those 2 years he started referring to himself, unprompted, at parties, as the primary earner. I let him say it. My pension deposits and my active duty combat pay were, at that point, larger than his commissions in 11 of those 24 months, and I have the direct deposit records to prove it, because I have always kept records. 14 years of classified work teaches you that documentation is not paranoia, it is survival. But I let him say it, because Patricia had raised him to believe that a man who is not the primary earner is not fully a man, and I did not yet understand that indulging that belief was the same as signing a slow confession that I did not matter. By 2022, when the market cooled and Daniel's commissions dried up to almost nothing for 11 straight months, I was the one covering the mortgage on our house in Fayetteville, the one covering Emma's after-school care, the one covering the health insurance premium before he switched us to his cheaper plan without asking. And still, at his mother's Christmas table that December, Patricia turned to a cousin and said, loudly, warmly, "Sarah does some kind of office thing for the army. Don't ask her about it. It bores her to talk about." And Daniel laughed along, and I sat there in my dress uniform jacket. I had worn it that year on purpose, quietly, as its own kind of statement, and not one person at that table asked me a single question about the ribbons on it. The legal trigger, the thing that turned a decaying marriage into a courtroom battle, started 9 weeks before that hospital hallway. Daniel had been having an affair for approximately 7 months with a woman named Vanessa Cole, 31 years old, a marketing coordinator at the same brokerage firm, and I did not find out through some dramatic confrontation. I found out because I am, by training and by nature, a person who notices when numbers don't reconcile. Our home equity line of credit, which I had co-signed in 2019 to fund a kitchen renovation, showed a draw of $180,000 in February that I had never authorized, never signed for, and never seen a single dollar of in our joint checking account. When I pulled the notarized loan documents from the bank, quietly, the way I do everything, without announcing my moves before I understand the full battlefield, the signature on the authorization line was mine, and it was not my signature. It was close. It was close enough to fool a notary working a double shift at a strip mall UPS store. It was not close enough to fool someone who had spent 14 years reading forged documents, coerced signatures, and falsified logistics manifests for a living. I sat in the bank's parking lot for 11 minutes after that appointment, engine off, hands flat on the steering wheel, running the same breathing pattern I had used before convoy briefings, in places I still cannot name. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Because panic is a luxury I trained out of myself a long time ago, and I was not going to let it back in over a signature line. I photographed every page. I made 3 copies. I put 1 copy in a safe deposit box under my own name only, 1 copy with my brother James, a master sergeant still on active duty at Fort Liberty, and I kept 1 copy folded inside a hardback copy of a field manual on my nightstand, in plain sight, because the last place anyone in that family would ever think to look for something important was inside a book. The $180,000, it turned out, had gone into a down payment on a $620,000 beachside property in Holden Beach, purchased in an LLC structure that listed Daniel and Patricia Reyes as co-managing members. My name was not on the deed. My signature was on the loan that funded the down payment. Vanessa Cole's name was listed as the property's designated rental management contact. I sat with that information for 6 days before I said a single word to anyone, because in my career, you do not move on partial intelligence. You confirm, you verify, you build the complete picture, before you take an action you cannot take back. On the 7th day, Daniel filed for divorce. He filed first, which I later understood was a calculated move by his attorney, a man named Marcus Whitfield who had a reputation in 3 counties for what other lawyers called, off the record, the shock and freeze approach. File first, request an emergency asset freeze, request temporary primary custody, based on any psychological allegation that sounds plausible and is expensive to disprove, and count on the other party being too destabilized to respond in time. Marcus Whitfield stood in the first hearing, adjusted his cufflinks in a gesture I would come to recognize as a tell, and told the court, with a small, practiced smile, that my documented history of classified deployments suggested a pattern of concealment and detachment, inconsistent with stable parenting. He said it like he was doing me a courtesy by phrasing it gently. I wrote the sentence down, word for word, on the legal pad in front of me, because I intended to use his own words against him later, and because writing things down, verbatim, under pressure, without emotion, is a skill 14 years of intelligence work had made permanent in my hands. Patricia attended every single one of those early hearings, seated in the second row on Daniel's side, and twice, in the hallway outside the courtroom, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to be overheard by the other families, waiting for their own cases, she said the sentence I now understand was the sentence at the center of everything. She's not fighting for Emma because she loves her. She's fighting because losing feels like losing a mission to her. She was never really a soldier anyway. She just processed paperwork, and now she doesn't know who she is without a desk to hide behind. I stood 4 feet away when she said it the second time. I did not flinch. I have been trained not to flinch at incoming fire that isn't going to kill me. And Patricia Reyes, for all her cruelty, has never once come close to killing me. I filed that sentence away exactly where I file everything that matters. Someplace cold, someplace I could retrieve later, at a moment of my choosing, not hers. If you've made it this far, you already know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. So hit subscribe now, because the next part is where every single one of those people finds out exactly how wrong they were, in a room they cannot walk out of. The sealed envelope came from a person nobody in that courtroom was watching, because nobody in that family had ever bothered to watch him. Robert Reyes, my father-in-law, 71 years old, a Vietnam-era Navy corpsman who did 2 tours attached to Marine infantry units between 1969 and 1971, had spent 40 years being talked over by his own wife at every family gathering, and 40 years, quietly, carefully, watching me the way one veteran recognizes another veteran, even when the rest of the room sees only a desk job. Robert had never said much to me directly in 15 years of marriage. A nod at Thanksgiving, a question about Emma's soccer schedule, a quiet offer once to fix a leaking gutter nobody else had noticed. Nothing more. But on the night of the phone call, the night Patricia told me to go beg the military, Robert drove 11 miles from the beachside closing dinner to my house in Fayetteville, alone, without telling Patricia or Daniel, and knocked on my door at 11:40 p.m. He was still in his dinner jacket. He did not come inside. He handed me a manila envelope, sealed, with my name written on it in his own handwriting, and he said 7 words to me before he turned around and walked back to his car. I should have said something years ago. I did not open it that night. I put it inside the same field manual on my nightstand, next to the forged loan documents, and I paid Emma's $5,500 bill the next morning, using the last of a separate Combat Zone savings account Daniel didn't know existed, because I have never, in 14 years, kept all my resources in one place where a single person could freeze them. I opened the envelope 40 hours later, at my kitchen table, at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, Emma's new insulin pump humming quietly on her nightstand down the hall. Inside were 4 things. The first was a notarized, partially declassified summary of my service record, obtained under a records request Robert had quietly filed himself, using his own veteran status and a connection from his VFW post, months earlier. Long before the divorce filing, long before any of this became a legal fight, because Robert Reyes had apparently decided on his own, in private, that someone in this family needed to know the truth about me, whether or not I ever chose to share it myself. The second was a sworn notarized letter from my former commanding officer, Brigadier General Thomas Okafor, retired, describing, in the limited, cleared language available to him, that then Major Mitchell had led classified medical extraction logistics for special operations units in 2 theaters, had personally coordinated the survival and evacuation of 11 wounded operators under direct threat, and had been awarded a Bronze Star with Valor device for actions the general was still not permitted to describe in full, but which he characterized, in writing, under oath, as among the most consequential logistics and combat medical leadership I witnessed in 31 years of service. The third item was smaller and colder. A forensic handwriting analysis Robert had commissioned privately, from a certified document examiner, comparing my known signature against the signature on the Home Equity Authorization, concluding with 98% confidence that the signatures did not originate from the same hand. The fourth item was a single photograph, printed, no note attached. Daniel and Vanessa Cole, standing in front of the Holden Beach property, holding a bottle of champagne, dated the same week. Daniel told me to deal with our daughter's medical bill myself. I did not cry. I want to be precise about that, because I think people expect a moment like that to break someone, and it did not break me. It did the opposite. It organized me. I have run pre-mission checklists calmer than most people run grocery lists, and that night, at my kitchen table, I built a checklist. I called my attorney at 7 a.m. sharp. Her name is Diane Foster, a retired Army JAG officer turned civilian family law attorney, 52 years old, who had taken my case specifically, she told me on our first meeting, because I spent 22 years watching brilliant women get reduced to a job title civilians could digest, and I am done watching it happen in a courtroom I have influence over. Diane read the 4 documents twice, in silence, and then she looked at me and said one sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. We are not going to leak this. We are going to let them walk into that courtroom still believing their own story, and we are going to let the record correct them in front of everyone who ever underestimated you. I agreed. Patience in my line of work is not a virtue, it is a weapon, and I intended to use it. The next 5 weeks were a slow, deliberate campaign of controlled information, and I want to walk you through exactly how each person in that family revealed themselves further during that time, because none of them changed, they only became more visible. Patricia hosted a birthday lunch for Daniel, and in front of 11 guests, told the table that I had finally shown my true colors, disappearing into work the second things got hard, just like always. A lie so complete, so upside down, that Diane later entered a guest's unsolicited text message about the comment directly into the court record, as evidence of ongoing reputational harm. Vanessa Cole, meanwhile, began appearing at Emma's school pickup line twice, uninvited, introducing herself to the front office as Emma's father's partner, attempting to have herself added to the approved pickup list without my knowledge or consent, an attempt the school's front office manager, thankfully, refused, and documented in writing because North Carolina custody protocol requires written parental authorization for any pickup list change, something Vanessa clearly had not researched before trying. The second time, she waited by the flagpole in sunglasses and a blazer clearly chosen for the moment, and when the office manager repeated that she was not on the authorized list, Vanessa said, loudly enough for 3 other parents to hear, "It's fine. Her mother's never around for this stuff anyway. Someone has to be." A sentence the office manager, unprompted, wrote into an incident report that afternoon, because it was, in its own small way, exactly the same lie the rest of the family had been telling for months, just from a new mouth. Marcus Whitfield, in a pre-trial motion hearing, stood and told Judge Elena Cabrera, presiding over Cumberland County Family Court for the past 9 years, that my unwillingness to disclose the specifics of my military service was itself evidence of a broader pattern of secrecy incompatible with co-parenting transparency, a line so aggressively confident, so certain of its own cleverness, that Diane simply wrote it down, underlined it twice, and said nothing at all, because she already knew what was coming. 2 weeks later, In a discovery conference held in a smaller room down the same hallway, Whitfield tried the same posture again, adjusting the same cufflinks, telling Diane directly, off the record, that juries and judges both respond to a clean, simple story, and yours has too many classified gaps in it to ever look clean, as if the gaps themselves were evidence of guilt rather than 14 years of federal law he had never bothered to read. The courtroom itself, that Thursday morning, smelled like old radiator heat and floor polish, the particular smell of public buildings that have been maintained but never renovated, and the benches were hard enough that I could feel the grain of the wood through my slacks within the first 20 minutes. Sunlight came in sideways through the high windows behind the judge's bench, catching dust in slow columns above the gallery, and somewhere behind me, a court officer's radio crackled once, low, before someone silenced it. The hearing that mattered, the one that decided custody, the asset freeze, and the outstanding fraud allegations, tied to the forged loan signature, was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the main courtroom of the Cumberland County Family Court Building, a room with high windows and hard wooden benches that Diane told me would be close to full, because 2 smaller preliminary hearings had already drawn a modest gallery of attorneys, a court reporter, and, unusually for family court, 3 retired officers from Robert's VFW post, whom Robert himself had quietly invited, along with my brother James, home on emergency leave, seated in his Class A uniform in the second row, directly behind me. Before I take you into that room, I need you to understand what it cost me to sit in the hallway outside it, waiting, because 30 seconds before the bailiff called our case, Daniel walked past me, closer than necessary, and said, quietly, just for me, "You know you're going to lose Emma over this, right?" Nobody believes the sad veteran act anymore. I looked at him the way I have looked at men across negotiating tables in places I am not allowed to name, the same flat, patient look I once gave a warlord's intermediary who thought silence meant weakness, and I said nothing, because I did not need to say anything. I had learned, 14 years ago, that the people who talk the most before a confrontation are almost always the ones who understand the least about what is actually coming. If any part of this has made your chest tighten the way mine tightened in that hallway, take 30 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button. Because what Judge Cabrera said 40 minutes later is the exact sentence Patricia had used against me, coming back around, in a voice with actual authority behind it. The hearing opened with Marcus Whitfield reasserting the same narrative he had built for 2 months. Unstable, secretive, absent, unfit. Judge Cabrera listened with the flat, patient expression of someone who has heard 4,000 versions of the same performance, and then she turned to Diane and asked if the respondent's counsel had anything further to submit. Diane rose, calm, unhurried, and entered into evidence. In order, the forensic handwriting analysis showing the home equity loan signature was forged, bank records showing the $180,000 draw funding the Holden Beach LLC purchase, the LLC filing listing Daniel and Patricia Reyes as co-managing members with Vanessa Cole as designated contact, and finally, the notarized, partially declassified service summary, along with General Okafor's sworn letter, which Diane requested be read into the record in full. Judge Cabrera read it herself, silently, for nearly 90 seconds. The courtroom that quiet, that still, is a sound I will never forget. And then she looked up, directly at Marcus Whitfield, and said, "Counsel, your client's motion characterized Lieutenant Colonel Reyes's military service as, and I am quoting your filing directly, unspecified trauma and prolonged absences inconsistent with stable parenting. I am now looking at a sworn statement from a retired brigadier general, describing your client's wife as directly responsible for saving 11 wounded service members' lives under combat conditions, for which she received a Bronze Star with Valor. I am also looking at a forensic report, indicating the primary financial claim your client's family has made in this proceeding rests on a forged signature belonging to that same woman. I would like you to explain to me how your motion survives either of those 2 facts." The room did not make a sound. General Okafor, who had traveled 4 hours from Fort Belvoir to attend at Diane's invitation, and sat quietly in the gallery in civilian clothes, a plain grey suit with no insignia at all, until that exact moment, stood, requested and received permission to address the court briefly, and said, in a voice that had commanded rooms far larger than this one, "Lieutenant Colonel Reyes was never a soldier who processed paperwork, Your Honor. She was the reason 11 families got their sons and daughters home alive. I would ask this court to remember that the quietest people in a room are very often the ones who were never permitted to be loud about what they did." Behind me, I heard Patricia make a small, sharp sound, something between a gasp and a word that never fully formed, and I did not turn around, because I did not need to see her face to know exactly what it looked like. The gavel, when she finally set it down between sentences, made a flat, dry sound that seemed to land in my chest before it reached my ears, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was quieter than I expected, quieter than any sound that had ever done so much work in a single second. Judge Cabrera did not simply deny the emergency motions. She referred the forged signature and the undisclosed $180,000 transfer to the district attorney's office for potential financial fraud charges against Daniel Reyes, named specifically on the record, with Patricia Reyes noted as a co-managing member of the LLC that received the funds. She granted me full physical and legal custody of Emma, on a temporary and clearly signaled permanent basis, pending final disposition, citing a complete absence of credible evidence supporting any of the original allegations, and a demonstrated pattern of documented dishonesty from the petitioner and his family. And in the final minute of that hearing, before adjourning, she looked directly at Marcus Whitfield one last time and said the sentence I had waited 2 months to hear, the sentence that closed the loop Patricia had opened in a hallway, weeks earlier, without ever imagining it would return to her this way. This court has heard, repeatedly, the suggestion that this woman was never really a soldier. Based on what has been entered into this record today, I am inclined to say she was never really underestimated by anyone who bothered to actually look. I did not cry in that courtroom either. I felt something unlock in my chest, quiet and total. The specific feeling of 14 years of being called a secretary, finally meeting 14 years of documentation that said otherwise, in a room with a court reporter, transcribing every word into a permanent public record. James squeezed my shoulder once from behind me. Robert, 3 rows back, sat with his hands folded and his eyes down, and I understood, watching him, that this had cost him something too. 40 years of marriage to a woman who had never once let him speak, spent, finally, on one envelope handed to a daughter-in-law he barely knew how to talk to. 72 hours after that hallway phone call, I want to bring you back to that exact number, because it matters. Daniel was standing at my front door, not in the courtroom, but at my actual front door, pounding on it with a closed fist, while Emma slept upstairs with her new insulin pump humming quietly on her nightstand. He was not there to apologize. He was there because the DA's office had opened a file, because Vanessa Cole had already stopped answering his calls the moment she learned there was a fraud referral attached to the LLC she was named in, because Patricia had, within 18 hours of the hearing, told him in a screaming phone call that he had embarrassed this family in front of a general, which I understood, even then, was not remorse. It was Patricia protecting her own reputation, the only way she has ever protected anything. I opened the door with James still in the house behind me, still in uniform, his hand resting near the small of his back out of old habit, even though nothing about this required it. And I let Daniel say exactly 4 sentences before I closed it again. Sentences about how he never meant for it to go this far, about how his mother had pushed him into it, about how he still loved Emma, about how he wanted a chance to fix things. And I told him the only sentence I owed him: you had 14 years to ask me one real question about who I am. You're 72 hours too late to start now. I closed the door. I did not open it again that night. In the 8 weeks that followed, the consequences settled the way they always do, not all at once, but individually, precisely, onto the exact people who had earned them. Daniel was formally charged with financial fraud tied to the forged home equity signature, and the brokerage firm he worked for, facing its own liability exposure, quietly terminated him within a month of the charges becoming public record in a small county paper. Vanessa Cole, Once the affair and the LLC arrangement became a matter of public court filing, was let go from the brokerage as well, and last I heard through mutual acquaintances, she had moved 2 counties away, though I no longer track her, because tracking people who no longer matter to me is not a habit I choose to keep. Patricia Reyes, for the first time in 40 years, found herself socially isolated in the very circles she had spent decades curating. The VFW auxiliary group she had chaired for 11 years quietly did not renew her position that spring, and I am told, though I did not witness it myself, that at least 2 of her closest friends stopped returning her calls once the full court record became known around town, the way small-town records tend to travel regardless of how quiet a family tries to keep them. She sent Emma a birthday card that June, the first in 3 years, with no comment about my little desk job tucked inside it. And I still do not know what to make of that, other than to note it, the way I note any change in a pattern that has otherwise held steady for 15 years. Marcus Whitfield's name, meanwhile, appeared in a local bar association newsletter that autumn, in an unrelated item about continuing education requirements, and I noticed, reading it, that his firm's letterhead had quietly dropped the words family law from its listed specialties. Robert Reyes and I have spoken more in the 8 months since that envelope than we did in the previous 15 years combined. He drives to Fayetteville most Sundays now, sits with Emma while she does her insulin checks, brings the same brand of ginger candy his own mother used to keep in her coat pocket, and he told me once, sitting at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he never actually drinks from, that handing me that envelope was the first thing I've done on my own in 40 years that I'm actually proud of. He also told me, quieter, almost as an afterthought, that he had kept a photograph of his own unit from Vietnam in his wallet for 50 years, and that no one in his family had ever asked to see it either. I honestly do not know if Patricia and Robert will stay married after 40 long years. I do not ask, and I do not intend to. It is not my war to fight anymore. Daniel wrote me a letter 4 months after the hearing, not asking for reconciliation, just acknowledging, in writing, that he had spent 15 years choosing not to know his own wife, because it was easier to believe his mother's version of me than to ask me any real questions himself. I do not know if that letter was fully honest or simply strategically timed before his sentencing hearing, and I noticed, reading it twice, that it was written on the same brokerage letterhead he used to use for closing documents, as if some habits outlast the job itself. I have learned not to need to know. What I do know is this. For 14 years, 4 months and 11 days, I served in silence, because silence was the job. I came home to a family who mistook that silence for smallness, and it took a sealed envelope from the one person in that house who had actually learned, the hard way, what it costs to go unheard for decades, to finally make the record match the truth. If there is one thing I would ask anyone watching this to take with them tonight, it is simple. The quietest person in your family, the one everyone calls just, something smaller than what they actually are. Ask them one real question before a courtroom, or a hospital, or a headstone has to answer it for you. Emma's blood sugar reading this morning was 104, right in range, the little screen on her pump glowing steady green, instead of the amber warning it used to flash. Her new pump working exactly the way it's supposed to, and in 3 days, I start a job I never expected to want. Training incoming JAG officers. In a plain classroom with folding chairs and a whiteboard still smelling faintly of dry erase marker, on how to properly evaluate classified service records in family court proceedings. Because Diane says there are 100 more women out there, sitting in hallways just like I was, still waiting for someone to open the right envelope. But that's not even the story you should be worried about right now. Because the next video on your screen is about the sister-in-law who thought she'd already gotten away with it. And if you made it this far with me tonight, you already know exactly what it feels like when the truth finally gets its turn to talk. So go ahead and hit subscribe, because you've already sat through the hard part with me.